Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be a bit different to normal. I'm not going to be doing a demonstration. I'm going to be looking at different types of lighting that you can use when producing representational art. So this lecture will mostly cover situations where you maybe have one particular focal point in terms of subject matter, or maybe a small group that are quite close together, and you have a single light source as well. So you might find yourself, if you're working from life in different situations, having lots of different light sources. This isn't quite so applicable. Today we're just going to be looking at if you've got one light source that you can sort of define yourself, different types of lighting that you could use and the different kind of effects that they have. So I've got my one of my plaster casts that I'll be using. I've also just got an LED light that I'll be able to shift around throughout the lesson, so you can kind of dynamically see the different effects that different types of lighting will have on the subject. So a lot of what I'll be talking about will actually be quite specific to portraiture or figure painting, but the general principle still applies with other still life objects. If you're lighting a still life, or if you're lighting a kind of large group of figures, you might have different types of lighting on different parts of the figures depending on the light source and depending on the number of figures and how they relate to each other. But basically I'm going to be covering 6 different types today. To quickly go over them, they include front lighting, 3/4 lighting, side lighting, below or kind of underneath lighting, lighting from behind which creates a silhouette, and lighting from above. Those are kind of, in a general sense, the kind of most common types of lighting. Obviously you get all sorts of variations within those 6 different types, or something might only just be side lit, almost 3/4 lit, or could be just subtly 3/4 lit from the front. There's loads of different permutations, but those are the sort of 6 extremes that we'll be looking at. So we'll begin with frontal lighting, which tends to be quite a kind of pure frontal lighting. So if I do it now, it tends to be kind of boring, a little bit too balanced very often. So you'll see it creates a sort of symmetrical light shape. So every kind of either side of the face, particularly in this instance where the portrait is completely front on, it makes the entire image look quite regular, which isn't necessarily the most interesting compositional look for an image. If the subject was, say, looking to the side, it works somewhat better, just because the shapes of the subject itself are kind of more asymmetrical. So even though the lighting is quite frontal, quite kind of regular, you still get interesting sort of shadows appearing just because of it casting shadows on itself. Whereas if we go back to it being front on, you'll see it just kind of bleaches out the entire image, or the entire subject. But one thing that is good about it is it works very well for giving a sense of three-dimensionality. So you'll see that the lightest parts of the object protrude towards us, and then as they turn away from the light source, which is also the viewer's look, kind of the direction the viewer is looking, they become darker. So it's very kind of evident where form is, even though there aren't many direct shadows because the entire image is illuminated. So it kind of makes it tricky to have interesting shadow patterns, but equally you have very interesting halftones, so lots going on in terms of modelling all through the image. And as I say, the interesting thing about it is because the light source is also the eye, essentially. Even if I put it a little bit lower, actually, you'll see more exaggerated. The only place that really catches any kind of shadow is just underneath the chin. There's a shadow, but otherwise everything's actually a light or a halftone, which is quite different to all the other types of lighting that we'll be looking at. But yeah, that's basically how frontal lighting works. So the next type of lighting we'll look at is 3/4 lighting, which probably is the most common type of lighting that you'll see, particularly in portraiture. It provides a certain number of shadows to kind of create a certain kind of asymmetrical quality to the composition, without having so much shadow that you don't get a sense of light in the image or a sense of form. So what happens with 3/4 lighting, the light is sort of at a slight angle to the front of the face, which means that you get a few shadows cast. If I go from this side, actually, you'll see there's a kind of shadow on the nose. The further across I move and the higher up I go, you'll see that the amount of light hitting that far side of the face reduces. You'll see this kind of lighting a lot in portraiture, so you get this sort of triangle shape on the far cheek, so the cheek that's furthest away from the light source. And it makes for a pretty pleasing, interesting composition. It certainly brings out the shape of the nose, draws a nice level of attention to the eye, without anything being too obscured in shadow. Usually you'll make sure that the light source is low enough that it does catch the eye as well. You'll see if I put it up quite high, you start to lose the eye, which makes for a certain, maybe a bit more drama. So it kind of depends on the mood that you want to go for. So as I'm kind of going through all these different types of lighting, something I want you to pay attention to is how the mood changes. So if you go back to frontal lighting, there's a lot less mood just because there's less shadow going on. Whereas as soon as you start to introduce more shadow, there's kind of more mystery in the face. The less the face is lit in 3/4, the kind of more ambiguous it becomes. When it's kind of lit just to the side, it becomes more regular, and then here you start to see it becomes a bit more obscured. So that takes us on to side lighting, which is entirely edge lit. And this doesn't tend to be used very much, just because this sort of straight line that you get down the portrait isn't usually ideal. It kind of cuts the form in half. It doesn't really help enhance form or create interesting shadow shapes. It certainly has a particular effect, so it is occasionally used, but not very often. If it was to be used, it would tend to be used in conjunction with a strong reflected light. So if you've watched my lesson on form, I think it's called Introduction to Form, you'll have seen me talk about different types of different aspects of the form as it's lit, so the light shape and the shadow shape, bedbug line, and reflected lights. So if I was to put a white piece of board here, you'll see that light reflects from that single light source off the white panel, so it could be a white wall, and then infills the shadow. So if you were to side light, you would tend to have a strong reflected light as well. It wouldn't be the type of lighting you'd use in a kind of pure chiaroscuro setting. But if you have a nice strong reflected light, you can kind of fill both sides of the image, and it becomes a lot more pleasing to look at. Sticking with reflected light, I also wanted to just show you something that's always quite interesting to look at, is just how much coloured objects can infill either skin or a white object like this. So this kind of pale blue-green, you can see how much it can fill the shadow and strongly colour it as well, which is quite interesting. I've also got a pink glove to use, but you can see just how strong those reflected lights can become. So something like that could be quite interesting if you were to use side lighting. So the next type of lighting I'll cover is lighting from below, and this is most commonly associated with sort of maybe horror films or ghost stories, if you think of people shining a torch from underneath. It can be interesting, lighting from below. It's not something we typically look at when we see people. They're usually lit from above, so it can certainly be quite dramatic, and it can produce quite interesting forms as well. And we'll now take a look at lighting from behind, which is also kind of often referred to as silhouette lit, or backlit. You'll see it's not super evident with the black background, so I'll just pop a white panel behind. So as you can see, you don't really get a great deal of detail in the subject if you light from behind. If it's kind of lit in this way from behind, you'll see you do get a little bit of edge lighting, some of the light kind of wrapping around, which makes for an even more ominous look than the underlit image. So it's quite reminiscent of, say, interrogations or something in a detective TV show or film. If you wanted a kind of mysterious figure in a multi-figural composition, you might have one figure lit from behind and other figures lit in a different way. So obviously the further behind that the light goes, the more of the image is obscured and the more it just becomes a silhouette. And as it slowly kind of starts to wrap around, you start to get more and more of the subject. Even this would probably be considered backlit, despite being kind of a back 3/4. Once it gets to here, it becomes side lit again. You could also have it backlit, then have light in front, or kind of a reflected light that kind of infills. So you can mess around with that sort of thing. As I say, it's quite a particular type of lighting to use. And the final type of lighting that we'll look at is lighting from above. So I'll just move the cast back again. So in this instance, because she's wearing a cap, being lit from above pretty much obscures all the top of the face. But it is a reasonably common type of lighting. The only downside of it is similar to front lit. It's probably not the most interesting in terms of shapes, just because it becomes quite symmetrical. Obviously that's dependent on how the object is oriented, so if we were to orient it to the side, it becomes more interesting. But if you've just got someone kind of facing you front on and the light's either directly from above or directly in front, it doesn't make for the most dynamic image. Usually you'll go for something more side lit or lit from below, something more unusual. One of the main problems of being lit from above is that it's not quite so evident in this subject just because of the cap, but anyone with a strong brow, it'll just hide all of the eyes, and generally in a portrait you obviously want to be able to see the eyes. It can be used to effect, as can any of the different types of lighting, but typically you'll want some kind of light on the eyes, or at least one of the eyes in a portrait, just to kind of give a bit of life to the image and character. People tend to find a lot in the eyes. But that pretty much covers it. So it's a bit of a whiz through all the different types of lighting. Hopefully it all made sense. I definitely recommend experimenting with lighting, so if you've got some kind of movable light, it's really useful in your studio. And if you've got a cast, would be useful, or you can even get someone to sit down for ages and mess around with different types of light, try different types of use different types of lighting to produce sketches or paintings. You'll find that it can be easier or harder to kind of give a sense of form depending on the lighting. So as I said, any kind of like 3/4 lighting is probably ideal for form. You get enough of a sense of the half-tones turning into the shadows without it being just edge lit. If you're trying to model just from the edge, and the edge of the image is the lightest, or the edge of the object is the lightest portion, it doesn't work quite so well three-dimensionally. It's nicer if you have something that's 3/4 lit, so that the lightest portion of the subject is kind of within the form, and it gets darker as it turns around to the shadow and darker as it turns away as well towards the edge of the form. So you generally want to go for something that's this is called crest lighting. So this is the crest and this is rim lit. So if something's lit just on the edge, it's rim lit. Rim lighting doesn't tend to be as effective, mainly because it'll draw too much attention just directly to the edge of the form, which becomes the lightest portion. If you want the form to feel well modelled, you kind of need the lightest portion of it to be within the centre of the form. But that's something you can sort of experiment with and see what sort of effect it has on your images, whether you find it easier or harder to produce form. But that's pretty much it. So we managed to cover different types of lighting and have a look at a bit of reflected lighting kind of working actively. And I might look at a kind of follow-up to this video with an actual sitter and experiment with different types of lighting, maybe produce some drawings or paintings, but that'll be in the future. So yeah, hopefully it was interesting. As always, if you have any questions, post them below, or check out the OCAD website for more lessons, and you can sign up to get direct tutorials with me to cover these sorts of things. But hopefully it was interesting. Thanks for watching.